So today the Commons are coming back from their summer recess, and there will be an emergency debate, if the Speaker grants it, to discuss this legislation, essentially forcing the Prime Minister to request another extension to the Brexit process if there is no deal agreed by October 19th. There might be enough numbers to pass that legislation, and we're expected, if it's the case, for the government to pass a motion to lay down a motion planning for a general election on the 14th of October.
So, I mean, this is extraordinary, the split that's emerged within the Tory party over this. Do you think that Boris Johnson will follow through on that threat to call a snap election? And will he get 2/3 of MPs that would be needed to agree with it on board?
That's right. In order for the election to be held, he would still need the majority of Parliament to approve it. It's not clear yet whether the Labour MPs would support that. The Labour Party is also deeply divided on Brexit, as is the Conservative Party. And another fear is that even if, for instance, Boris Johnson calls the election and sets it on 14th of October, ultimately it's up to the Prime Minister when the election is held. So if the Parliament approves that motion, afterwards the Prime Minister could still change the date and say, well, let's hold it after 31st of October. And in that way, he would deliver his promise to take the UK out of the EU on the 31st, and that would either with a deal or no deal, as he says. And
but is that looking less and less likely that Britain will leave without a deal on October the 31st?
That's. I mean, it is at the moment a very likely scenario because the negotiations are basically just technical negotiations, as the EU pointed out just today. Boris Johnson says there was some progress. Perhaps there was a slight shift on the EU's position, especially in recent meetings with Chancellor Merkel and President Macron. But the Commission still has its position that the withdrawal agreement will not be renegotiated, and it is waiting for the UK to come up with proposals that will be an alternative, a viable alternative to the Irish backstop, that solution that helps to prevent the return of a hard border on the island of Ireland. So at the moment, there seems to be an impasse there, and essentially Boris Johnson has set himself this red line that the UK will leave on the 31st. So basically he has not that many options left. Either he breaks his promise, or he breaks the law if that bill is passed, or he holds a general election.
So would a general election necessarily be the circuit breaker that he would need? Or, as former Prime Minister Tony Blair has put, would a better option be to have a second referendum? Clearly that would not necessarily be in the interests of Boris Johnson, but would it be in the interests of the country?
Well, this government has repeatedly refused, as Theresa May's government, to hold a second referendum. So I would not see it as a likely option in the next few months. The general election is just Boris Johnson basically will kind of frame it as the fault of Tory rebels. They have, if they vote, a number of them vote for the bill against the government, he could sort of put the blame on them and say, well, you are responsible for a general election. And a lot of the next few months will depend on whether there's a general election and what is the result, because it is possible that Conservatives get a majority. In that case, Boris Johnson can basically change the legislation and leave on the 31st, as he promised. I mean, it would make it much easier for him, because with the hung parliament and the first past the post system in general just makes it much more difficult for Parliament to agree on the future of Brexit.
Anna, you said earlier that Boris Johnson had said that he was making progress on potentially a new deal in talks with Brussels. But the Daily Telegraph in the UK today is reporting that his chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, said in internal strategy meetings that he considered fresh negotiations with the EU to be a sham. So how damaging is that?
Well, the thing is that Boris Johnson is trying to give a sort of portray negotiations as being in progress, but we see even on the EU side a rejection of this statement, because indeed there are technical negotiations going on between the two teams. They are meeting, but on the vital question here that prevents the deal to be ratified on the backstop, on the Irish backstop, there is very little progress, and that is one of the reasons why we might be heading for a no-deal scenario.